There have been quite a few pandemic hits, multiplayer video games that saw their height of their popularity come at a time many people were forced to stay inside or not travel. We've covered a high-profile one already, arguably one of the highest profile, but there is another that shared in similar popularity and capitalized as a party BR game released during a time when people couldn't party. Fall Guys was one of the fastest growing titles we have ever seen, launching in August 2020 on Steam and PS4, and growing to a whopping 50 million players plus across multiple platforms. They grew so much they would be acquired by competition, Epic Games, and turned exclusive within just a few years. This would eventually lead to their abandonment on Steam and eventual drop in population, a serious drop. Until now, according to Steam charts, the game struggles to break 1,000 players peak, or on average, less than 0.5% of the game's original population there alone. Fall Guys as of 2026 is technically not dead yet, but it's massively slowed down on all platforms and no longer manages to be a part of daily discourse like it used to be, being an absolute shell of what it was before. And so, detectives, why did Fall Guys go from a place in the history books to a forgotten footnote in a gamer's gaming library? We will find out that and more in this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or die, utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, developer testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction, where we, as the classic detectives do, crack the case for good. You know, in case you missed any of the clues along the way. Customize your jelly bean and let's survive this wacky game filled with mini-games intent on making you splat. To the case. The story begins back in January of 2018, where the early ideas surrounding Fall Guys would formulate. Originally known as Fool's Gauntlet and even Stumble Chums, the game was a battle royale composed of largely physical challenges. Meteoric, an independent game developer who largely had a game development history of being a flash conversion merchant stationed in the UK, would have two major creators at the company team up together to head the game, Joe Walsh and Jeff Tanton, who would formulate their game pitch utilizing a pitch deck to which they would pitch over 10 different publishers until one in particular would get back to them, a fan favorite publisher these days. Devolver Digital would answer the call and announce Fall Guys June 9th, 2019. Prototyping for Fall Guys would begin quickly after, growing the development team to 30 people, and Mediatronic's main goal was to balance minigames around a 50-50 chaos and skill spectrum, combined with the fun and zany physics engine that, according to Walsh, was deliberate, because falling over is funny, and if you remove the ragdollness of the game, you remove the comedy. These were wise words. Fall Guys was like they took inspiration from classic party games and introduced a ton of physics engine goofiness on top of it. The concept was simple, but was remarkably unattempted as a game style, especially with how it had, battle royale roots, where players must qualify to survive the next round, with the winners making it to the final round and then winning. Each of the maps would introduce different obstacles and challenges players must overcome, some more race-centric, and some more about pressing the right buttons. There was also things like maze maps and more puzzle-like maps, of course. The skill floor was incredibly low, but that was on purpose, to allow for players of all age groups and gaming styles to enjoy the game, which would come in handy later on. Fall Guys would drop on PS4 and PC August 4th, 2020, less than a year after it was originally announced. Fall Guys would score impressively on aggregate review website Metacritic, managing to rate at an 81 out of 100 from 52 different critics. IGN, who would score it an 8 out of 10, would call it a great collection of exciting minigames and a burst of every color under the rainbow, makes Fall Guys a consistent delight. And GameSpot, giving it a lower 7 out of 10, would love how approachable and goofy the game was, while not liking the non-competitive aspects of the game. Which, I got news for you, Fall Guys wasn't designed to be competitive. So if you go in getting mad at the RNG that's gonna misplace your character at some point, you're in for a rough time. The gamers, though, or fans of Fall Guys, would rate the game quite highly, which you can see from their very positive reception on Steam from over 167,000 players. Fall Guys had managed to drop during the pandemic, time many countries were enacting travel bans and restrictions, making many people house-ridden more than usual, contributing to way more players at home for more time of the day. This would greatly benefit Fall Guys, of course, ballooning its population, or at least helping, with the help of popular name streamers, up to 172,000 players peak on Steam alone. Fall Guys had, like Among Us, become a gaming pillar almost overnight, and during its rise in popularity, few ever saw it being toppled from its position. Mediatonic, like Innersloth, had went from a quiet indie game developer to a major one, boasting now hundreds of developers. Fall Guys would organize their content drop in the form of seasonal updates, starting with their first season at launch, and then the second, October 8th, 2020. Season 2 would introduce the show selector, allowing players to choose a special weekly playlist and introduce a medieval theme present in things like the main menu, loading screens, and even more of the assets introduced. To accompany the main season's structure would be mid-season updates as well, titled Point Fives. Though these are called mid-season updates, they basically just happen like a month after the regular season, which kind of dulls the impact a bit for me personally. Most importantly, this update however introduced a new round or map, Klaxon, filled with rotating blades and a ton of dive jumps, and that's only important because it's one of my favorites. Season 3 was a big update, introducing not only the winter theme with it, but a handful of new rounds and maps alongside it, including a multi-team snowball creator mode, Snowy Scrap, or the Penguin Pursuit, where you must hold a penguin the longest to win, like Halo's Oddball. Update 3.5 would introduce some more variety to pre-existing maps, switching up some of the obstacles and introducing a snowball survival mode where players must now try not to fall on collapsing tiles while surviving falling snowballs. Though it's around this time population-wise, you start to see Fall Guys return to a more normal player count, not one inflated by streamers and extra stay-at-home gamers. And these weren't bad numbers, with a 32 max player lobby, of which were mostly filled by players, since bots were only really playable or played in the solo games. Likely being finalized before these numbers are not totally taken into account perhaps, would be news that Epic Games would acquire Mediatonic outright, also acquiring Fall Guys in the process. This was a part of some major hirings and acquisitions from Epic Games in an effort to be more competitive with their newly launched games marketplace, the Epic Games Store. The acquisition was a no-brainer though. Fall Guys had been making more money according to reports than the entire platform of the Epic Games Store. And while I normally like to celebrate people getting paid, especially with how long Mediatonic had been working at things here, in the case of Fall Guys, the acquisition left a bad taste in my mouth. Anytime you see an acquisition in which all of the founding members depart, like in this case David Bailey and Paul Croft, it's usually purely a money play, with a little naivety sprinkled in between. It feels a bit like you're abandoning your previous coworkers to the fate of a corporate notion from now on. Now sure, this could be leveraged in a bunch of different ways, and maybe you make a bunch of money, form a new company for example, and repeat the process again for more people on the team, or move on to more ambitious projects. In the case of Mediatonic, it just seemed to get people paid in my opinion. But Epic Games was essentially paying serious money for a game that no longer, even so soon, was nearly as popular as it was before. And while this would totally be fine for it as an indie game, or with Devolver publishing like they did, now Epic Games was expecting Fall Guys to make more money than their entire store. And that was a heavy burden that would come with some serious consequences. Epic Games would carry on things routinely from there on, dropping the next season, Season 4, March 22nd, 2021. Season 4 was the Season of Squads, and would introduce a number of team playable modes to the game for the first time. This update also came with a couple new maps as well. And then custom lobbies would finally hit May 13th, 2021, including even more variations to go alongside them. This would jump the population up to about 18,000 players peak in the summer. Season 5 and 6 would drop in the summer and fall respectively and introduce a ton of new themed maps, more limited time events, and would start to introduce cross-platform progression. The catch was you had to make an Epic Games account, and this is when players started to realize for the first time that the acquisition was going to be more than just business as usual. To coincide with a major free-to-play switch would come the free-for-all update. This update wouldn't just make the game free now, it would signal the permanent departure from Steam for Fall Guys, no longer even being acquirable there. Players could still play from Steam and get access to the recent updates, but no longer had full platform support. This would end up being one of the most controversial moves in the Fall Guys timeline, and worse, it was a self-inflicted wound. Epic Games saw how many people were still playing on Steam and thought, well, we want those players too, without any actual thought applied to how they could pull people off of Steam when they were an inferior platform. Though it's arguable if this change was the biggest catalyst for the loss of players for Fall Guys, as that would come a bit more gradually. But it's one of the most commonly cited reasons for people telling me why they didn't play the game anymore. Just, food for thought. It's not like Fall Guys was the only title that failed to bring people to another platform, and not even the first for Epic Games. Following this change to the Epic Store, the updates for Fall Guys would reset, sort of, starting back at Season 1. This seasonal update would add some new maps, but more importantly, introduce Fall Guys to the Nintendo Switch and the Xbox. This would allow Fall Guys across all of its platforms to hit an impressive 50 million players, and that's half the size of World of Warcraft's players overall, one of the largest virtual worlds in MMORPGs. But Fall Guys was a hit with all age groups and was able to penetrate popular culture in just a few years, an impressive feat. And not a single virtual world has ever even gotten close to mimicking something like that. And that's not even me just daggering for no reason. I just like to remind people that virtual worlds in MMORPGs are niche by, comparing them to games like this. Season 2 would drop another slew of new maps, or rounds, and this was an overall, all-around good update. The problem is, however, it would also introduce one of the most controversial features in online live service gaming, one that Destiny fans know quite well: vaulting. Sorry if I triggered any Destiny fans. Mediatonic announced they would be introducing vaulting, a concept of taking old content and locking it away, while you rotate newer content. Vaulting would be introduced partially during Season 3, November 22nd, 2022, but this was also a season that added a new time track trial mode and a new mechanic, dive sliding. But be fully introduced, vaulting that is, March 7th, 2023, right before the Season 4. If you pay attention to the population stats on Steam during this time, you can see the largest drops in population for the game yet. Vaulting wasn't popular, and I can personally account for this, as I tried playing the game during this time with my cousin, and we were immediately turned off by how we couldn't play some of our favorite maps, and even in some cases we kept encountering the same maps. I think the population reflects this, dropping below 5 figures for the first time. Season 4 was a dope season, all things considered, as it introduced the creative mode, which allowed players to make their own maps. And while this was an absolutely great update, giving the game almost infinite replayability in the form of community map making, it's seen negatively in kind of a weird sense, since it was the last time that Fall Guys seemed to put any significant effort into new maps. And Season 4 would also signal the end of seasonal updates, with the promise for more frequent updates to come, which usually translates to more updates, with less in them. And it's a way that content starts to kinda get heavily stretched out. With the population of the game on Steam falling to just 5,600 players peak, Fall Guys would never manage to climb above this player count again. The Summer Breeze update is a good example of my theory, as it barely added anything at all, but expanding the creative mode a bit more. The Fall Force update is similar, though it also made some Battle Pass changes, I guess. The population had dropped another 2,000 players at peak on Steam, and this sort of update was a sign of that sort of thing. This creates a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. As an online game starts to downsize and slow in updates, it also starts to lose more players in the process. And while that's a natural process for online gaming, Fall Guys was supposed to be the main moneymaker for Epic Games, and the golden goose wasn't laying eggs anymore, just like a year or two in. What came next seemed almost inevitable, with the scale of how large things had grown for Mediatonic, rumored to be in the 200+ developer range now due to growth. But nobody, myself included, would assume to the degree Mediatonic would be decimated with layoffs. September 29th, 2023. Rumors were claiming that the layoffs would lead to the whole company even being shuttered, and others, which is seemingly what came to be, said that Mediatonic would be met with a total culling of the dev team, with a skeleton crew only to remain. This was a part of a larger layoff at Epic Games, where they would cut nearly 16% of their workforce. The former founders of Mediatonic were long gone and paid off, and while they can claim this was not something they expected, I just find that hard to believe is all. Fall Guys updates would continue, though like the ones before, they were almost all geared towards expanding the creative mode, which tells me that the train had all but slowed for the game, and when that happens, the focus is on community content. That's the best play to make. Though the remaining crew working at Mediatonic working on Fall Guys would manage to remove vaulting May 7th, 2024, during the Fall Forever update. The updates might have been lean, likely mimicking the amount of developers left on the project, but the moves being made were still pretty good ones. But this makes sense when you consider that Joe Walsh was still around and leading the development on the project, choosing to stay with the ship instead of leave during the acquisition or the big kerfuffle. Fall Guys would have a mobile launch sometime in the fall of 2024, though I struggled to see how it would thrive there with the control scheme, and well, I haven't heard or seen much about it since then, so I don't think I'm the only one that thought that way. 2 more updates would hit in the fall for Fall Guys: Scrapyard's Stumble update and the Halloween update to coincide with the holidays. 2 more updates focusing on expanding the quality creative mode in Fall Guys, which had grown to something pretty impressive now. Fall and Fantasy would introduce the first non-holiday themed update in a while and include a unique soundtrack. And then the Ranked Knockout update that would drop April 1st, 2025 was the first time serious new content was being added to the game. Sure, it was just reskins of the regular game modes, like most BRs, but at least it added a progression track and a way for more competitive players to try and be matched together, because although it wasn't very good, SBMM did exist in Ranked Knockout. Mediatonic had one last card to pull for its player base, that on Steam at least had dropped almost under 1,000 players peak, and that was doing some of their own maps, utilizing the same creative mode that they introduced, which was a nice touch, but a sign to me once again that their level of involvement was probably out of their hands at this point. I think this is reflected by the next timeline event, and that was when one of the key creative forces behind Fall Guys, Joe Walsh, would depart Mediatonic August 1st, 2025, and I think we have to give Joe credit. He really seemed to try and stick things through, and was making good decisions, but expectations weren't met for the game, and thus it got hamstrung years ago already, and it was just hobbling on. I can only imagine, besides the major layoffs forced onto Mediatonic, that Epic Games wasn't keen on putting any more investment into Fall Guys either, and I'm also keen to imagine that Joe's departure was a sign of things to come. The final update as of the spring of 2026 for Fall Guys was the Slime Factory update, which dropped September 16th, 2025. This update was remarked by the community as the first update that didn't actually add anything at all, and that was kind of fitting that it was the last. Epic Games had seemingly moved on, and whoever was left at Mediatonic working on Fall Guys was just running the servers at this point. But Joe Walsh would strike back, following his departure from Mediatonic, and would announce another online game based on physics, puzzles, and platforming, dubbed Frog Squad. Though it looked more like a co-op game than a battle royale, which was an interesting twist, and more like Amazon's King of Meat, which we already covered in the Death of a Game series. This could open up more lanes for things like unique gameplay and a narrative focus, but to be honest, I'm not incredibly sold on Frog Squad yet. It looks fun and has a goofy, nice style to it, but I'm not sold on the gameplay loop of a co-op physics-based platformer without any story to it. After radio silence for 5 months or more, Mediatonic would make an appearance in January 21st, 2026, and what was announced was a single limited time 3v3 map. But here's the kicker. It was a game mode for Fortnite. Yeah, you heard that right. After taking a multi-month hiatus for content and updates, Mediatonic, or what was left of them, had cooked up a Fortnite mode. All of the remaining air was just squeezed out of the proverbial balloon, and I just have no words. According to a report, March 25th, 2026, senior staff that was remaining at Epic Games were confused about the company's direction, especially regarding game development. The reporter also investigated Mediatonic, one of their properties still, and returned with a whole lot of nothing. Mediatonic was alive, reportedly, but barely, with no news on how many of the company's developers were left, or what the next game in the making was either. Mediatonic had become catatonic. The timeline has ended, detectives, and that means it's time for the final deduction. We have to crack this case for good. And in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Fall Guys slow down so much after such an unbelievable start? Well, they popped a bubble. Epic Games' acquisition and management subsequently. Vaulting. Boo. They moved from Steam to the Epic Games Store. Fall Guys took a hell of a fall. Sorry, I waited all video, so cut me some slack. But seriously, Fall Guys is a game I have dozens of hours in, and I had fun just about every time I booted it up. And I'm sure many more watching this now feel the same way. While it's hard to totally feel bad for the fate of Fall Guys because it was sort of inevitable after their sell, I do feel a little when a cute, fun multiplayer game starts to fade away, even if it's not totally gone yet. But enough reminiscing on the time I beat 7-year-olds in a platforming battle royale, let's move on to the next case. And it's a controversial one for sure, from one of my most hated companies. Thanks for watching, and let me know in the comments below your thoughts on Fall Guys, and any reasons you think I missed for why it faded away so quickly.